Awesome. Okay, so we'll go ahead and get started. So thank you to everybody who is here to join us this afternoon to learn a little bit more about different laws that were passed this last General Assembly session. I'll introduce myself again for folks that just hopped on. My name is Jenny Glass, and I'm the Director of Advocacy for the ACLU of Virginia.
And I'm Claire Gastignaga. I'm the Executive Director of the ACLU of Virginia.
So what we're going to do today is kind of talk about all the different changes that folks can expect, the impact that those changes in voting laws are going to have for individuals, for organizations. If there's organizations on this webinar, kind of thinking about how this impacts the different work that you're doing, and we'll talk a little bit about sort of what is coming next and what still needs to be done in the voting rights arena. If you have any questions during the webinar, you can go ahead and I think we'll probably end up using the chat box this time, but just go ahead and chat your question, and we'll have some time at the end where Claire and I can go back through that and answer anything there. So first of all, there's a lot of change coming because we had a lot of problems that needed to be fixed in our system. So Virginia has long been pretty notorious for being a difficult place to cast your ballot. We have been ranked second or 49th, whichever is easiest for you to imagine, but in the country for ease of access for casting your ballot. And if you're curious, number one is Mississippi. So that's because we have a voting system that has really been rooted in Jim Crow era restrictions that have purposely sort of tied and interwoven our criminal legal system to our right to vote, and kind of intrinsically linked those two things, so that you're seeing a lot of restrictions that are geared at a particular audience, and that is to kind of bar lower income individuals, to bar African American voters from being able to participate in the system. We're still a really long way, I think, from where we want to be as a fully accessible and equal and fair system of voting in Virginia. But one of the reasons we want to do this webinar was because we have passed nearly 20 bills in the last year that I think are putting us on a road to finally making voting a little more accessible for all Virginians, and there's some stuff to celebrate, and we don't get to do that often, so we want to do that. So hopefully this is a positive part of your day-to-day to learn some of the changes. Before we get too deep into the changes, I want to go over just some common terms, just so no matter who's coming to this webinar from wherever you're at, we can all be on the same page. So we're going to be talking a lot about HB and SB and mentioning those on the slides. Really, that's just talking about where the bill originated from. So it's not super pertinent, but it just matters this is where, if you wanted to log into our legislative system and see it originated from a delegate filing the bill or a senator filing the bill, that's what that means. Then we're also going to talk about a few different parts of our voting system for who their kind of key actors are that control some of these decisions. Especially, this is pertinent if there's a process that needs to be created that hasn't been yet, or a bill kind of designated a certain agency or part of our system of voting to do something. I think it's pertinent to know who those actors are for future advocacy efforts. So when maybe they do a bad job, we can go talk to them about it, or if there's some kind of system that gets created that's not as much as what we would have envisioned, we can advocate for it to be different. So that's the Department of Elections. They really are key for just establishing the voter roll. That's all that really means there. They maintain our voter roll, who's on it, who's off of it, and they also control and distribute absentee ballots at home and for overseas voters. So you'll see them pop up a lot in any kind of changes to the absentee voting system. The State Board of Elections of Virginia, we'll probably just be referring to them as SBE. They really are about the regulations, the training, the governing of some of the more local, once you start getting down to the local elections. Still statewide, but once you get down into general registrars and the officer of elections inside individual counties and cities. They also create the standard forms for like voter registration and elections. So they will be a lot more involved in sort of training procedures or things that kind of guide the officers inside inside the counties and cities. Then you have the general registrar. Every county or city has one. Correct me if I'm wrong, Claire. It may be one of those situations where they're shared. But a general registrar is really, your go-to person that's handling all voter registration, and they're actually appointed by the local electoral board. So, there's a Norfolk City registrar, there's a Newport News registrar, there's a Arlington registrar. And sometimes they're involved in the administration of different things. So you'll see them pop up a little bit in some of these bills as well.
Yeah, I think it's important to point out the State Board of Elections is mandated by the Constitution and laws to maintain a uniform system of election across the Commonwealth. It's really their job to make sure that everybody experiences the voting system the same way. And the person that administers that department is now called the Commissioner of Elections, and that's Chris Piper.
Yes, Chris Piper will be maybe a key actor in this system. I think it's good to start knowing some of these names because these people are responsible for a very important part of what it means to, have a democracy in the Commonwealth. So,
and the local boards of elections are people that you should get to know as well. Every time there's a change in governor, the local boards are required and the state board is required to be a majority of the party of the governor in office. So you switch over from a Republican governor to a Democratic governor, then a lot of people, there's a lot of turnover, obviously, as you move 2 to 1 and vice versa. So right now, the majority of all of those boards represent the party of our current governor. So the majority are Democrat.
Oh, good to know. So a lot of the laws that we're going to talk about today, some of them are a lot of the effective date or the date when you can expect these changes to go into effect. It's going to be July 1st, 2020. There's going to be some parts, some laws that we talk about, some bills that don't go into effect until later, maybe another year, where they actually require the legislature to vote again before they go into effect. So we'll make sure to note when that is applicable to a particular bill. Because obviously we don't want anyone here to think that you can do something earlier than you can, or that something is going to impact you before it actually does. I did actually have a question that even as I was, putting some of this stuff together and thinking about this webinar that I wanted to ask Claire, which is there any significance to July 1st being the day that we have picked to be the day that laws go into effect, other than that it is the month of my birth?
The Constitution sets out the way that legislation is adopted and becomes effective, and that's all laid out. When the legislature votes on bills in the winter, unless they adopt an emergency clause, which makes things go into effect earlier or immediately upon adoption, then the Constitution specifies that the laws go into effect on the 1st of July. So that's why we always look to the 1st of July to see all the new things that the General Assembly has done. And the only exceptions are if there's an emergency clause that's passed, or there's something called the caboose budget bill that sometimes has language in it, and that goes into effect as soon as adopted too. That's the budget bill that makes any adjustments in the current biennial budget. So since it only extends till June 30th, anything in it goes into effect immediately. So for the most part, people just need to know that if the General Assembly enacts a new law, the normal course is for it to become effective in July of the succeeding year. Sometimes they delay effective dates, and we'll talk a little bit about that as well as we go forward, where they've specifically said for reasons that have to do with budget or difficulty of implementation, sometimes they'll set an effective date beyond the 1st of July.
Awesome. So I think Claire is going to talk about some of the changes that we have covering accountability and accessibility getting a little bit better, and that's going to cover some changes that folks already probably heard about, but voter ID laws. So
well, one of the most exciting things that's happened is that we've swapped out the Lee Jackson holiday for a new Election Day holiday, which means that there'll be a state recognized holiday on the first Tuesday in November, Election Day. And it should help expand access to the ballot box for millions of Virginians. Now, we'll talk a little bit later, probably at the end, about COVID-19 and all of the impacts and other issues. But I think one of the most important points about the Election Day holiday is that because state employees and other teachers, local employees likely are going to have the day off, that expands dramatically the number of people who could choose to volunteer to be election officials, and could make it much easier for us to attract and train and retrain and retain people as election officials in the local polling places. So, I mean, I think that's going to be not only expanding the access to the ballot box, but expanding the ability of people to be active participants in administering elections going forward. Second thing that's important is we'll have more accessible ballots and materials. There is a part of the federal voting rights laws that requires accessibility to people with whose English proficiency is not as great as others, people who maybe whose first language was a language other than English. And in the federal voting rights, there's a certain percentage requirement for when you have to provide materials in a language other than English. Under our new state law, starting September 1, 2021, we'll have an independent state requirement to provide voting and election materials in languages other than English. And that's great because no matter how long you've been speaking English as a second language, you know, when you are trying to do something as important as voting, it's really important to be able to have access to materials that are the most accessible to you and the easiest for you to read and understand. And that sometimes can be the first language that you spoke, which might be something other than English. And then third, we're going to have better records. So, you know, there's always been a concern about making sure we have a paper trail when we vote. There was a time where we went to electronic voting machines that didn't have a paper trail, and people rightly became very concerned about accountability and making sure that we really had a record of the vote that you cast. And so now we'll have a requirement that the State Board of Elections keep a record of your ballot, whether it was cast on a machine or on paper, and we'll have accuracy of recounts. So there's a clear, it's really an election security issue and a way of making sure that our votes that we cast are the ones that actually get counted. So all of those things are really important. So this is voting ID laws. This is like Back to the Future, and we're going to talk about this as an example of something that speaks to us in terms of what we'd like to tell you about what we want to see happen in the future. We'll get to that. But we have gone from a place where it used to be you could walk into a poll, show your utility bill, and vote, and that was all that was required. You just needed to be able to show that you were a resident of the precinct and that you had something that said who you were. In order to create barriers to the ballot box, in our view, Virginia passed pretty onerous voter ID requirements that required you to have a government-issued photo ID or an ID issued by the local registrar. Those restrictions are being lifted as of this July. We're kind of going back to the future. We're going back to a time when you could show your voter registration card, your bank statement, your utility bill, something that said, this is who I am, but not necessarily a government-issued photo ID. And we're going back to that place that we were before that said, if you show up without one of those things, you still get to vote by signing an affirmation that you are who you are, which you sign under oath and penalty of perjury, which would make you a felon if you lied. And that if you sign that, you can go ahead and vote in the normal course. So, I mean, we still have the same government ID requirement for May local elections and for June primaries. But after the 1st of July, we'll be back to a much more open process of showing you are who you are when you go to the polls.
I think that's probably one of the reforms that's gotten probably one of the most airtime, the biggest amount of airtime coming out of the session. We also did made a lot of changes to our voter registration system in a way that I think is going to streamline it a lot now. And in the next slide, we'll talk about how I think it's going to get even more streamlined in the future. So just a handful of things that changed here. I think one of the biggest is that we passed an opt-out automatic voter registration bill. And I want to draw special attention to this being opt-out as opposed to some different systems of automatic registration that are opt-in. Opt-out is actually the preferable method that you would want that an advocacy organization like the ACLU wants to see. This is where really anytime you're conducting any form of a transaction at the DMV and you're not registered to vote, but you do meet the eligibility requirements of voting, that the DMV is going to automatically register you as long as you meet those qualifications. So this system kind of basically will come in where if you don't want that, you can check a box and say, actually, I don't want that. But for the most part, that means more people will be registered, will get their registration up to date when they're changing their address or anything like that. And because most people don't want to go the extra step, just like they didn't want to opt in. And if that was extra, opting out is just easier. There's also a kind of a smaller bill that happened, a couple, and then I'll get to I actually want to skip over the denial one, but and come back to that. But there's one around requiring public schools to provide voter registration materials to all students who are eligible to register and offer them actually time to complete the registration during the school day. It's a great reform, small change that will just pick up that many more people to register. And the fact that they're giving students the time to do that during the school day is great. The other one I wanted to look at is that.
Yeah, it's particularly important because high schoolers, I mean, anybody who's within 6 months, who's going to turn, 18 within 6 months of the election, can be registered before they actually turn 18. So having them be able to register in high school is doubly important because it gets people into the system early in a way that ensures that they'll be registered by the time of the fall elections.
Right, and I think it also lessens a little bit of that burden on other organizations to feel like they need to come into spaces where they may not have even been required or had the ability to come in the past and do these kinds of events. But that's why I think, jumping to Senate Bill 857, that actually kind of looked at some of those spaces where there have been previous restrictions around being able to have a voter registration event and loosened it. So now you can register people to vote at a public high school, and now you can come to a naturalization ceremony and register people to vote. Just some of these restrictions that when you look at them and you think, why couldn't we do this? Why was this even restricted before? It's kind of silly, but we went through this and kind of fixed it this year. The last one on the slide is especially important to me. I used to work in political campaigns, and we did a lot of voter registration. I'm sure there's folks on this webinar right now that do this a lot, and it's very disappointing for a person to come to election day and find out they actually were not registered to vote, and they thought they were registered, and through some kind of accident, a misstep, a missignature, a missed checkbox, something, they find out then that they actually can't vote. And it's just super disappointing for that person. And then sometimes you even find out from that person that happened, and it's just sad. So what this does is it actually requires the general registrar to notify anyone who has applied to vote and been denied within 5 days of that denial. A lot of times folks can come back and fix these issues pretty quickly if they know they happened. And some registrars do this, I think, on their own, but it's not mandated and it's not required. So we will now have to provide an email or a phone number on a voter registration form so that you can actually get back in touch with that person. But overall, I think this is actually one of those kind of things that's small, didn't really get picked up a lot in newspapers that this happened, but pretty big reform, honestly, for folks when it comes to actually letting people know and being transparent in a way that they can help cure the process before they get to election day. The other big reform that happened here is same-day voter registration. I am personally very excited about this, and we worked really hard at the ACLU of Virginia to help pass this legislation. So to see this be successful, it was really, really monumental for us. But Virginia is moving to a place that by 2022, we will have a system of early one-stop voting, which is pretty incredible. Some states, there's about 19 other states that have some form of early voting, whether it's E-Day registration, where you can register to vote on election day and vote in the same experience, or you can do that beforehand. But Virginia had neither, so we were very behind the times. And I think with the combination of the no excuse absentee bill that Claire's going to talk about in a second, and this, we've actually, really, I think, passed probably some of the most impactful reforms that you can make to a voting system. To increase turnout among lower income individuals, voters of color, people that are working second jobs, and are having challenges to meet some of those cutoff deadlines. So what this bill does is that it eliminates voter registration deadlines, and I would say point blank, that's kind of the purpose of this specific bill. When you combine it with our 45-day window of time that Claire's going to talk about with absentee voting, then you start to actually create a system where people can go to vote early, absentee in person, and register during that same interaction. It's important to note that the impact of this bill is not going to be, or the effective date of this bill is not going to happen until 2022. And that's because it's going to take some changes to our system. We currently are not ready to do this, and I'd be the first to admit that. I think, but the good thing is we have other bills that are going into effect earlier that are already going to create the need for some of these changes. And you know, voter registration deadlines, they had a lot more purpose a while ago, and now that we've moved to systems where we're using e-poll books and lots of online registration, they're just not as needed as they used to be. So ultimately, you know, we're super excited with this bill. Especially, we'll follow it along, make sure nothing changes to you know, change what has already been passed. But as of right now, starting in 2022, Virginia will start implementing this, and I think it's going to be a really historic change and impact turnout in a really, really big way. Back to you, Claire. Oh, muted.
All right, so no excuse absentee voting, House Bill 1. This is pretty historic. There was a time back in Governor Gilmore's administration where the General Assembly passed no excuse absentee voting, and then he vetoed it, and nobody's been able to get this bill to the governor's desk since. So the fact that it passed this year is historic. And as of July 1, you will no longer have to have an excuse to vote absentee. I mean, it used to be the case that you had to have one of 17, or depending on how many sub-paragraphs you count as separate requirements, up to 20 different excuses. You were pregnant, you were taking care of somebody who was not, you know, who was sick. You were out of town, you were away from your office, away from your home on business. There were all these different excuses, and what most people didn't understand about having to give those excuses was they were all public. So anybody could have gone to the registrar's office and looked at your application for an absentee ballot and found out that you were planning to be out of town for the election, or that you were pregnant before you were ready to tell anybody else. So, I mean, it's both a privacy issue and a government intrusion issue, but it's also a barrier to voting issue. And so we're really glad that we are going to have no excuse absentee voting as of July 1. And there'll be no reason required. You can vote absentee in person or by mail for any reason, starting 40 days out from an election and up to the Saturday before Election Day. Let me just do a little aside here. The ACLU is not in favor of mail-only voting. We believe that it is really important to preserve the ability of people to vote in person and by mail, whether they're voting in person on election day or voting early at the registrar's office by voting early absentee. We really think that, at least for now, by mail voting, exclusively by mail voting, is likely to exclude whole classes of individuals from feeling that they can access the ballot box. So we're in favor of preserving both ways to vote. And secondarily, we do still have an unfortunate witness requirement for our absentee ballots. We are in court seeking to have that requirement found unconstitutional across the board. We were able to get a partial settlement that covered witness requirements for May election, for the June primary elections. We are still in court and still working to make sure that that witness requirement is not imposed in November. So more to come on that. We think a witness requirement for absentee ballots does not, in fact, have the anti-fraud effect that people argue it does. There are many other ways to assure that people are voting with integrity. And we think it's just a way of keeping people from being able to vote easily in the way that they want to. So we'll keep working on getting that witness requirement gone. But right now, our partial settlement is that it's been waived for the June primaries based on COVID-19 and the importance of ensuring that people can vote safely while there's still social distancing. But that story has not ended yet, and our fight has not ended yet, and we will continue to work on that. Other things that happen with respect to absentee is that governing bodies in counties and cities, are encouraged to create new satellite absentee voting locations. We'll be keeping a watchful eye on that because it's really important that those locations be set up in places so that everybody in the jurisdiction has equal accessibility to those satellite locations and that they're not skewed in favor of certain neighborhoods or certain zip codes within a locality. And then it's easier to apply to vote by mail because you can now, there were certain classes of voters that were given this privilege before, but now everyone can apply for a ballot up to a year in advance and get on a permanent list of people who want to receive absentee ballots. Before, you would have to keep reapplying for each election unless you fit in some very narrow classes of privileged voters who weren't required to do that. So I think overarching principle here is that the changes here that we fought for are principally directed at making sure that no class of voters, no set of voters, no kind of voters are privileged to vote in a way that other people aren't, so that everybody gets the same access to the ballot box. Now, in the future, if the bill passes again in the next session, you'll get postage paid envelopes, which is, we think, really important. It can be a small barrier, but to some, and a huge barrier to others. But the government ought to make it easy for you to vote absentee by not requiring you to find a stamp for your ballot. We're also going to be extending the deadline for returning the absentee ballot. Currently, it has to be in the registrar's office by the time the polls close on Tuesday. Now it just needs to be postmarked on or before the date of the election and received by noon the third day after. We also, people have been concerned that the mail is not as speedy as it might be. And so there has been a change to build in some more time for the application to be received, process and the ballot to be sent out, recognizing that 7 days might result in your not being able to get your ballot in time to be able even to return it by postmark on the day of the election. And then there were issues around first-time voters and having to go in person to vote by mail. You couldn't vote by mail the first time you voted, you had to go in person. And that's been in the way of people who are in local jails who are eligible to vote, but have never voted before. And so it'll be really important to do more focused registration of people who are eligible, who happen to be in jail, either awaiting trial or incarcerated on a misdemeanor. And now they can actually vote by mail absentee without having to go to the polls in person the first time they vote. So that'll be good. So all these things taken together reduce the layers of privilege that previously dictated who could vote how and when, and made the ballot box more accessible to everyone.
So in a nutshell, there's a lot of changes that are coming. We developed this graphic to sort of cover some of the bigger ones. And we'll kind of push this out on social media, but it kind of summarizes, not, where we've been in the past, really bad ranking, 49 out of 50 states on how difficult it is to vote in Virginia. We truly are, after 2020, expanding access. In the past we had excuses and now we don't. In the past, you couldn't register on election day, and effective 2022, you can. So, there's just, it kind of runs down some of these changes that we've gone through through the slides today. But I think, one of the big things that we are focused on and are thinking about as sort of is just classic ACLU, but we are, thinking about what's next and what still needs to be done. And, with all these reforms, it could be easy to think like there's really nothing left to do, or we've gotten what we wanted. And we definitely want to appreciate and applaud the efforts that have been made so far, and just continue to push and put some pressure on our elected officials, our legislators in the General Assembly, that there's still actually one kind of huge thing that is a gigantic barrier to true enfranchisement, true democracy here in Virginia. And also all these reforms that we're talking about, they need to become permanent, and we need to move to a place where reforms like what we just talked about over the last 30, 40 minutes here, they're not relying on political will, that they are relying on, they have a place in our Constitution. So, something the ACLU is incredibly invested in at this point, and, in preparation to launch a campaign, looking at, what means with COVID and everything that's come up. But, we want to pass a constitutional amendment that affirms the right to vote in our state constitution, to make sure these reforms are not reversed, and that we fix a huge problem we have in Virginia, that we are still one of only 3 states that permanently disenfranchises people who have a felony conviction. And in Virginia, that actually is a very impactful amount of people. I mean, we're talking about a very serious amount of people who are still on parole or probation, and these 500,000 people that still have a felony conviction. And the process right now for getting your rights back is never going to be probably better than it is right now, and it's still cumbersome. And it still puts Virginia in some big top lists of states that disenfranchise based on felony conviction. The process for getting your rights back, it just can only go so far. So, especially considering, our point of view is that the right to vote should have never been taken away to begin with. We initially started this webinar talking about Virginia has a voting rights system that historically is just rooted in Jim Crow era restrictions. And this is one of the biggest ones that we see across the whole country, but especially in Virginia, based on being one of those very few states that says you are permanently disenfranchised. And I think that may come as a surprise to some folks, actually. So I kind of want to ask Claire, actually, folks, I think, actually look at Virginia, and even sometimes we're represented as a state that is better at this, or is restoring all these people's rights, and it's doing so much with this. But so why are we focused on this if that's where we're at?
Well, we're focused on this because the Constitution says that you lose your right to vote even if you just stole a $5 chicken, which is a felony, or you told an untruth on a state application, which is a felony. And what the Constitution says, and it does date back to Jim Crow, and it was put in place at the same time of our old poll tax and our literacy tests were put in place purposefully to disenfranchise Black people who were in the post-Reconstruction era. And what it says is that you lose this right forever unless a person, the governor, chooses in his or her wisdom or politics to give it back to you. And, the ACLU has been working on restoration of rights for decades with, greater success in recent years than in past years. But even when Governor McAuliffe did 176,000 individual restorations of rights, that left 300,000 to 400,000 people disenfranchised, and 1 in 5 African Americans in Virginia. And because of the impact of the longer sentences that were put in place after 1995 when we went to no parole, combined with the increased racialization of our criminal legal system, the number of people being disenfranchised is disproportionately African American. There are 11,000 to 12,000 people a year being felonized and losing their right to vote. And the governor, at last count, this governor has been averaging about 10,000 to 11,000 a year restorations. But the majority of those restorations are people who were convicted many, many years ago, and a majority of them are white, even though a majority of the people who are currently disenfranchised are African Americans. So the only way for us to get racial justice at the ballot box in Virginia is to have true universal suffrage. In other words, to ensure that everybody who's 18 and a citizen and a resident of Virginia can vote, and that vote can never be taken away by the legislature. I mean, the reforms that we've been talking about could be wiped away next year, if the legislature decided to wipe them away. I mean, we've been back and forth, as I mentioned, on voter ID. We've been back and forth on no excuse absentee. And we want to take this out of the realm of legislative action by passing a constitutional amendment that guarantees a right to vote to every person in Virginia, 18 and over, who is a citizen and lives here. And it is, fundamental. We always think of voting as somehow fundamental to a fundamental right, except that it doesn't say that in the Constitution. And we needed to say that in the Constitution. Voting is the essential currency of democracy, and it belongs in your wallet. And government shouldn't be able to take it out of your wallet or mortgage it or tell you that you have to give it back, and they'll give it back to you when they think you have earned it back. So it's going to take a real shift to move our thinking from thinking that people should get their right back when they're good enough to they should never have lost it in the first place. And that's why we're going to be looking to all of you to help us make this happen. And we'd love to be able to be on the ballot in 2022 and to see if we can convince all Virginia voters, a majority of Virginia voters, to constitutionalize the right to vote. But it is,
Yes.
People should not lose sight of how real the jeopardy is that all of these reforms could go away tomorrow if the legislature changes and the will to keep them is gone.
And I think that that's really confusing from my past experience and in doing a good deal of canvassing, phone banking, talking to people about voting, in the smallest change can be very jarring and have a dramatic impact on whether or not a person decides to go to vote. So even all of the stuff that's been happening with the May and the June elections, where I'm sure there are people that believe they're in fact, my father-in-law yesterday told me that he thought that the May election had happened a couple of weeks ago. And, that did not get the memo that it was actually on the 19th and did not know that the June primary had changed. So it's very hard to communicate reform. So it would be really great if we could just do it once and not have to go back and say, actually, the voter ID law used to be this, now it's this again. Now it's actually this other thing, and now it's actually that thing again. I think it creates a lot of challenge for folks to remember what is even the law when it keeps changing so frequently. Which is why there are lots of places in the law where it says, you can't make changes to voting reform rapidly. And I think that it's interesting because that applies to this too. And I don't want to dip too far into process, but it is a long-term plan of ours to pass this amendment. And we're in a really interesting place with it, actually, I think, because COVID-19 has really thrown a wrench into a lot of advocacy organizations' work and kind of shifted the urgency of where we need to be and what kind of reforms we need to be pursuing. But with this, we're in a kind of a fragile timeline where we may or may not have the political will to do this, but we have a majority support from some polling that we've done of voters in Virginia to support giving people the right to vote affirmatively and having it become a right that's not taken away. We want to capitalize on that, and we need legislators to come on board. And we're not 100% sure of this yet, but we may be in probably one of the best positions we could be to have that support. So we still think, even in light of COVID-19, that it's important to keep charging ahead with this, with the right to vote, and talking to legislators about it. So to Claire's point, anyone who's out there that's listening, start talking to your legislator about this. It might seem like a pie in the sky idea, but ultimately, when you break it down for folks and ask them, is it fair that people have their rights taken away related to something completely unrelated to voting rights, they think it's kind of crazy. And this is ultimately a part of our Constitution that is deeply, deeply rooted in racism. And to me, that is factual. because if you look back at the 1902 Constitution, when this was put into place, it was very clearly stated on the General Assembly floor that the reason for this part of our Constitution was to keep African Americans from voting, and that is plain as day. So I think it's frankly kind of astonishing we haven't moved past it yet, or that there are still states that have this and don't look at that as the history of it and want to change it. But we're in a position now where I think we can take advantage of some of the political landscape we have, and I hope anybody on the call that's listening, becomes a supporter of this as we keep launching and continuing to move forward. Well, we've moved to that portion.
There are a couple of the. One person has asked me to go back and try to make clear what we said about mail-in ballots. Look, we are in favor. Yeah. We are in favor of making it easier for people to vote by mail. Let's be clear. No excuse absentee is about making it easier for people to vote by mail. We have no problem with that, but we are not supportive of mail only. And we're not supportive of mail only balloting because unlike a homogenous state, a largely homogenous state like Oregon, there are very deep-seated issues about equity in mail. There are deep-seated issues about housing insecurity and people who don't have ready access to mail and don't trust, frankly, the mail system. And so we really believe that mail only in Virginia will have an oppressive effect, if you will, on people being able to vote, particularly from people who have housing insecurity, people who move frequently, young people, and also people of lower income and particularly people of color who just don't trust the mail system. So we think it's really important that there be access to the ballot box, both in person and by mail.
I'm going to go to one question that may have already been answered kind of, but got asked later in the webinar, so maybe it hasn't. I'll direct this one to you, Claire. Will these laws go into effect July 1, even though the bills haven't had their second pass through the legislative process? I'm not 100% sure if that's.
Yeah, no, I mean, the way the legislative process works, when there is, when a bill's passed by both houses and goes to the governor for signature and he signs it, it goes into effect that next July unless there's some specific thing like a reenactment clause. And a reenactment clause is something that says this doesn't go into effect unless it's reenacted next time. So that's where we are with SameDay. At some level, it's postponed enactment because of the need to make sure that the systems are in place to be able to deliver on same-day registration. But all the other stuff that we were talking about, if we didn't say there's a specific delayed effective date, they go into effect July 1, 2020. I'm not sure what the reference to second pass through the system is. The only time there's a second pass is if there's something called a reenactment clause that says specifically that a bill doesn't go into effect unless the General Assembly enacts it again.
And just to be totally clear, there's a reenactment clause on prepaid postage, so that's going to have to get voted again in 2021. There actually isn't a reenactment clause on SameDay. There's an effective clause, so that it's in theory they could certainly come back to that bill and say, hey, we actually think this we need to look at this again. So they could do that, and that's where I think a lot of that advocacy can come in to say we don't need to look at this again. I think we did the right thing here. There's another question on, and I think you probably have addressed this a little bit. The witness requirement is it's very frustrating. There's a question about whether or not there's any chance to get a witness waiver for May 19th elections. This is an election that it's not statewide, but it's impacting probably close to 900,000 voters in Virginia, which is not a small amount, and it's impacting some of our largest cities. Newport News, Chesapeake. There's some big Norfolk. There's so not to discount some of the smaller towns and municipalities that have these elections, but Claire, I think you talked about this a little earlier, but if if there's anything to add.
Here's the problem. The problem was that I don't know if those of you who are more deeply engaged in some of this stuff than others would know that there was a big case out of Wisconsin, and that Wisconsin case ended up not getting people where they wanted to go because the courts said, the federal courts did not mess around with local elections really close to the elections. And so when we went to court to try to get the witness requirement set aside because of COVID-19, we were really close already to what was then scheduled to be the May 5th municipal elections. And we didn't feel that we could at that time get the court to enter an order. We continue to believe, and we have said this in litigation and publicly, that the State Board of Elections has a regulation that says that ballots submitted without signatures should not be counted. We think the law would allow them to change that regulation to say that ballots submitted without signatures can be counted, and they can change any regulation they want to on 3 days notice. They're not subject to something called the Administrative Process Act, which would set out a really long process for doing it. So we're continuing to advocate that they do what they could do, which is change their rule that tells local registrars that they can't count these ballots. We think they can. We think the witness requirement in the code only says that it is there to prevent you from your vote from being challenged, not to dictate that your vote be thrown out. And we're going to continue to advocate for the state board to change its rule. In terms of our ongoing lawsuit, we're going to try to get a federal court to agree with us that the rule is an unconstitutional burden of voting for the fall elections. But advocacy with the state board is the only way right now I think we're going to get a change made that's uniform statewide in the municipal elections.
I'm going to go to another question about this. The witness requirement is a hot topic, but is there a delayed effective date on the permanent absentee voter list law? I don't believe so. That goes into effect immediately to create that law or list. Another person asked, Chesterfield received the June primary absentee ballots and there was no notification of the witness waiver. Was that a requirement as part of the waiver? And try to handle this. I don't believe it was. They actually just updated their website to say, and I want to say that we actually have a board member that's on the electoral board for Charlottesville, and he told us, point blank, they were already preparing these ballots to get mailed out early, before the court order had come down. So I would fully expect that the ballots you have still, say on the envelope, you need a witness requirement. It still says probably in multiple places that you need to have a witness sign the ballot and open it in the presence of a witness. But if you go to elections.va.gov now, it will say, actually, this is waived, and you don't have to meet this requirement for the June primary if you can't do it based on safety. So it's not going to be on the ballot anywhere in particular, which is not great, because if you're not tuned in and you're not aware, you might still believe that you need to do that. But that's part of the public awareness, and even doing webinars like this to try to get that message out to folks that we saw a problem, we sued in pretty classic ACLU fashion and got a victory. But it's it's going to be on our team, but also newspapers and the Department of Elections and state boards and local boards to let people know that this is the change.
Yeah. Somebody asked why failure to fill out the form should be acceptable. You're still required to sign your ballot and you're required to submit it. You're just not required to get a witness. And we don't think a witness improves. It was put in place in order to make it difficult for people to vote. And it does not, in fact, have a salutary effect on preventing fraud. So we just think it's unnecessary and it shouldn't be enforced.
Another one about someone receiving a ballot that actually did have a slip of paper in it saying, hey, the witness requirement's not required. So this actually gets to kind of highlighting some of the problems we've seen with our voting system in light of COVID-19, is that general registrars are kind of in some ways going rogue, which is good. I mean, so if, for instance, like, but I think that to get to my point, the highlight of the gap is they're allowed to go rogue. So some, mainly because there aren't consistent kind of statewide guidelines on this. So, and Claire,
I mean, we've sought to get uniformity and as part of the settlement agreement and notice to voters of what's in place. So hopefully that'll get a little, you'll see more of the green slip in people's envelopes than not.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, it really is, like I said at the outset, the State Board of Elections is responsible for ensuring that we have a uniform elections across the Commonwealth, and we'll be working to hold them accountable for their fulfilling that duty and responsibility.
Right. Well, I don't know at this point if we have any more questions. Oh, there was one that I kind of left out here, actually. Are Virginia's homeless able to vote?
Yes.
They are. I actually, when you register to vote, the form actually just requires you to put, basically, well, it defines residence as where you lay your head at night and where you can receive mail. So if you are, even if you're at a homeless shelter, even if you're sleeping under a bridge, as long as you can get your voter registration card, sent and registered all that way with where you lay your head at night, you are allowed to vote in Virginia. Actually, one of the few things I think we do well or have done well.
A lot of strong advocacy around making that the case. So it didn't happen accidentally.
Well, that's all the questions that we've gotten. I really appreciate everybody who joined in, and please spread this information around. We're going to be there was lots of comments in the questions about are we going to share this presentation and the graphic, and we certainly will. We want it to be blasted out wide and far. So folks know more about the changes and what they can expect, and we'll probably end up doing a revisit of this webinar and maybe doing it again in July. But yeah, I mean, thank you all for joining. Thank you, Claire, for sitting in and thanks to our comms team behind the scenes who have been quietly monitoring everything and make sure we don't screw up. Yeah. So appreciate everybody, and have a great rest of your day.
Yeah, thank you all for being with us.